Sherry at Savvy Business Resolutions with the final episode of the first series of Investing in Conversation, Conflict Management for Managers. But you don't get rid of me that easily, I'm already planning the next. Last time, we talked about something that works with and actually enhances everything else we've talked about since the beginning of the series. This time, I'm busting a myth, helping somebody speak from experience, and sharing a tip about something we've actually been talking about since the first episode. Speaking of which...
Listening becomes more difficult the higher you get in an organisation because you're supposed to know. You're supposed to be a great leader.
I wanted to do what I would consider an introductory presentation, so I labeled it Visual Communications 101.
Yeah. I've spotted a problem.
Yeah, so I'm glad, gold star you, because you spotted it quickly. It took me forever to spot this.
Well, I think a lot of jargon is shorthand. It's a reference to shared experience or shared knowledge that the group has, and they know clearly what it means, and they don't need to give a lengthy definition or explanation each time they use it. But it's also a way of showing members of the group that you're part of the group by using their jargon in the correct way.
There are plenty of managers who believe that if they empathise with their staff, they're going to look soft.
Yes, that makes sense. And I think we're living increasingly in a culture which believes that management should be strong and tough.
Women in the West aren't deliberately lowering their voices because they think, oh, I need to lower my voice. That's where culturally we've kind of seen nice female voices going and the women are following it. And it seems to follow this going into the workplace. Again, because the voice is something you can change. You can't do much else about being a woman. People just have to lump it.
One of the important things for managers of organizations to remember is that the cost of the employees is considerably more than the cost of the environment they're providing for the employees.
The thread that runs through all the conversations I had with Julian Treasure, Colleen Jolly, Chris Arnhem, Graham Music, Sophie Scott and Jennifer Veach is culture. This week's myth is something I alluded to on last week's blog. Basically, human needs are the same the world over. On that post I said that building a healthy workplace as defined by the World Health Organization, that's one where workers and managers collaborate to protect and promote health, safety and sustainability, starts with making sure that basic human needs are met. So I outlined some tools to help you do that, including Abraham Maslow's original 5-level hierarchy of human needs and motivations. You might have come across this, it's very, very well known in business psychology. But I have to say, some critics seem to have got the wrong end of the pyramid on this one. When they say Maslow putting belonging slap bang in the middle of the hierarchy below esteem and self-esteem shows that he thought it was less important, they're looking at the model upside down, literally. The first level are all the things we can't live without: air, food, sleep, water. And the needs become less essential as you rise up through the levels. Above the biological and physiological needs, at level 2, you've got safety and security. And to function properly, we all need some sort of shelter and to be free of pain and discomfort, don't we? So far, so universal. Actually, dodgy link alert, the belief that everybody has the same basic human needs is an example of cultural universalism. That's most common in places like the UK and US. At the opposite end of the spectrum, you've got particularist societies like parts of Asia and Africa. In those communities, the belief is that you can't just apply the same practices and principles to everybody without adapting them. How you apply these things depends on the specific circumstances, which means you've got to get to know the people you're dealing with. Those communities are also more likely to rely first on faith, whereas in places like the UK and US, faith is a very individual thing. Culturally, we're more likely to put our faith in science. Just to complicate things though, science is heavily influenced by the culture producing it. For instance, in episode 4, the myth was more than half of every message is visual. I said at the time it was the most famous statement Professor Albert Mehrabian never made. It flows from the universal truth that sight is the primary human sense. That's been woven into our culture since Aristotle's time. And in later years, it was backed up by neuroscience. Now, good science questions even the most established facts. And that's what's happened in neuroscience. That's another story for another pod, maybe. But culturally, the belief still feels like fact. I'll be honest with you, I believed everybody saw sight in the same way until I did a show with Professor David Howes of Concordia University. David's also the founder of the Centre for Sensory Studies. Unfortunately, I can't play you very much of our conversation because the tech failed on the day and we had to do it on the phone. And the time difference between here and Canada meant that my elderly mum was downstairs in the room directly below me watching telly at full volume. I think it was Jeremy Kyle. But here's a short clip about the Anlo-Ewe people of Ghana, whose priorities are balance and movement.
Hearing was very important to them, more so than seeing, than sight, than visual information. And indeed, the Anglo-Ewe say that the worst condition that you can have is to be deaf, because it interferes with your hearing and arguably, also with your sense of balance.
If you're wondering what that's doing on a business pod, I play it to you to prove the most unassailable fact, the truth, the incontrovertible evidence could actually be a cultural belief. It's always worth asking the question. Maslow's hierarchy, which was built on plenty of scientific evidence, says that once we've filled our biological needs and our safety and security needs and our need to belong, all humans need esteem, including self-esteem. In more individualistic societies like the UK and US, that makes perfect sense. But in a more communitarian society like Japan, that would be meaningless. When the group comes before the individual, whether the group is a family, a company, or a nation, what matters is that you achieve what the group needs or expects. Misunderstanding around that sort of thing creates so much conflict, and not just in international business. Of course, it's an oversimplification, really, to say that any nation has a culture. Yes, there's going to be a dominant culture, but that's going to be influenced by all sorts of groups within the population, with their own shared values, attitudes, beliefs, and so on. The terms I've been using here, universalism versus particularism and individualism versus communitarianism, are not mine. They come from the best set of tools I've ever found for understanding cross-cultural business communication. It's the model of national cultural differences developed by Fons Trompenas with Charles Hampden Turner. If you haven't come across it, I'm going to outline it on the blog. The first word on conflict management is collaboration, but the last word is culture, because that runs over, under, around and through everything you need to collaborate successfully. I was prompted to start researching culture by the argument I had over time, which I told you about a couple of programs ago. If you haven't heard the show, I was saying to somebody, well, of course, time is the ultimate finite human resource, isn't it? And he said, yes, but what if it isn't? And we ended up having a really heated discussion, a full and frank exchange of views, I think it's fair to say. One thing I can confidently say about time, though, is that it does change culture. Looking at just one of the 7 dimensions of Trompenas' model, globalism has softened universalism. The idea that we can just take our principles and our practices anywhere and apply them without adaptation is losing traction in favour of the understanding of something I'm always saying. Perception begins with perspective. What we see, or think we see, starts with where we're looking from. There's an example of that not quite going to plan in the next section. As I've said, culture isn't all about geography, but international business is a rich source of stories about cultural cock-ups. I ended the show with one last week, and this time Colleen Jolly, who we first heard from in episode 2, is going to speak from experience about another one.
To prepare for my first trip, as I said, I was very excited to go and thought I'd be, quite well prepared, got my suits in order, got my ticket. And a good friend of mine bought me a book for doing business overseas. It was focused on mostly Western Europe, and every chapter of this book was set up for a different country. So I went right to, the UK section and read this chapter. And in it, there were different sections on things that would be of particular pitfalls. So there were things about how one would conduct oneself in business, how one would address the concept of business cards. Some countries, there's more of a ceremony around that, as well as a special section for women in business.
Oh.
Which I, of course, avidly read, wanting to make sure I was conducting myself appropriately for my audience. And there were a couple of things that surprised me. They weren't quite the way that I operated in business. Such as the few things that really stand out to me was, number one, that a woman at any sort of a business, luncheon or dinner, etc., does not finish everything on their plate.
That wasn't me.
And it wasn't me either. I grew up, part of the kind of quote unquote clean plate club, and was going back for seconds and thirds. So the idea of, not finishing a dessert was really going to be just murder on me.
What a waste.
It was. So, but I thought, okay, well, if British women don't do that, and if I'm going to have any chance of getting along with these people, then I will not do that. So that was my takeaway number one from this book, which I should say was published the year before my first business trip. So this was at that time a very current book.
Okay, because I was going to say 1950s, maybe. But no. Okay.
No, it was a very current book. I checked twice just to make sure. And so the second thing that really stood out as something that was not quite my normal mode of operating in business was that women would always wear skirts or a dress. And if they were, and when they were wearing these skirts or dresses in the business sense, they would always have to wear pantyhose, tight.
I'm still in the 1950s here, I've got to say. This is still sounding very 50s.
I know. Well, they didn't say anything about garter belts, which probably would have been a good sign that it was from the 50s. Well. And I personally am not really quite a fan of, kind of stuffing 10 pounds of sausage into a 5-pound bag. But I dutifully went out and I bought, loads of nude stockings and black stockings to make sure I was completely prepared. So those two things stuck out as things that were going to be a bit difficult, but that I was going to do my best on my first venture into international business.
So far, we can't finish everything that's on our plate because we'll never get our fat legs in the tights. That's how it's working, isn't it?
Yeah, apparently so.
Okay.
Yeah, so I went to this lovely conference where I was invited to speak. I was the only American. I was the only female speaker. So I was very concerned that I was doing these things appropriately. And when I was sitting at, probably by now, the third time between drinks and breakfast and lunch and now dinner, watching all of the women around me finish everything on their plate and go back for seconds and thirds and fourths, and thought, perhaps this book is not quite right. And when I finally got up the courage to lean over and ask one of the women sitting next to me about this, I was met with similar to your response, asking if I found this book from the 1950s. No. So it was... It was a bit embarrassing, to say the least.
At least you tried to prepare. I think, top marks for that. The fact that I didn't even do that when I was going to the States. I just thought, well, like you said, we speak the same language. We all speak English, don't we? What's the problem? And anyway, I've watched so many American shows on TV. I've got a pretty good grasp of where the differences are. No. Within the first 24 hours, I was thinking, why do I feel like a foreigner? Help!
Oh, I know. It's terrible. We presume when we go somewhere, maybe, Tokyo, somewhere where they speak a completely different language, we prepare. We want to learn how to say a few words or understand what the signs are going to be in the airport. But yeah, we get quite lazy when we go to another presumably English-speaking country.
After that, my tip has to be, if you're working with another culture and you want to learn about it in advance, check your sources. You're much safer investing in conversations with people on the ground. Colleen could very easily have provided our light note to end the show on, but for that, I'm actually going back to the discussion on transatlantic networking. I played you a clip from this earlier in the series with Ardell Fleeson, Mark Amtower, Chris Tollest, and me.
I have an American story. I was 20 years old, staying in the home of my friends at Oxford, who are still my friends, and their son was the 8th, Thomas Snow, the 8th of their family, named the same name, to go to Winchester and Oxford. And in my really wide open, wow, what a cool old family way, I said, wow, you could call him Thomas Snow the 8th. And my friend looked at my dear friend, the mom, said, no, dear. And I just felt like squash. Oh, man, what a mistake I've made. But there's an example of, we see that as like you can mark 8 ticks on the wall. It's a different...
Notches in the gun.
Yeah, it's a different culture.
I love getting American business cards that say, Henry Smith the 23rd or whatever. I think people do that. It's
we
great.
do that. Well, my
That's
son is George S. Fleeson III, and we're very proud of that. We've gone 3 generations. Yeah. It's an English person's nothing.
Since what, the tree? I'm not sure my family's on the 3rd generation of using utensils to eat.
Is that the British side or the American
side? That would be the American side.
Right, that's it. The end of the series. While I'm away from the pod, I'll still be blogging, so keep an eye on that. And as always, I wish you a peaceful and productive week and beyond, of course. And I'll talk to you next time. If you need help with any aspect of conflict management at work, come and talk to me. All my details are on the website, savvybusinessresolutions.com.